we're having to.
Sorry.
That's fine. Some of which we're now having to remove. And this is not me knocking the processes or the practices of the 1950s. In fact, they kept the building safe. And without the work that was done in the 1950s, it might not have survived. And also, the teams at the time, some of whom you can see in this picture, were dealing with the materials that they had around. And post-war, one of the things that I hadn't realised, but has become quite an issue for us, post-war, because of the shortage of materials in this country at the time, we used American red oak. It turns out, and we talk about this gently with our American cousins when we talk about fundraising, turns out that American red oak isn't the same and has not been structurally sound enough, has caused all sorts of issues because it's just not been the kind of solid structure that we needed. So we're having to remove the majority of the American red oak that was used in that 50s conservation period. And then the house reopened in 1951. And I'm going to see next week, actually, I've invited him over, somebody who was party to all of this and who remembers it as a child. For those of you who know my predecessor, Levi Fox, his son remembers as a boy being taken round and looking at this building prior to it going over to the trust. And he's going to tell me about where all the weird bathrooms were and what all the wallpaper looked like. And we're going to record that conversation. That's all part of the story of this house. But the story for SBT began in 1949. It's another picture from the time. And we've got so many of these wonderful photographs, and Jim, our cataloguing archivist, has been brilliant in rooting out all of these photographs. And I think at some point in the future we should have a little display or an exhibition of them all, because there are some really, really wonderful images. Moving forward in time rather substantially, in 2012, the rear jetty started to move to such an extent that as an emergency measure, these external steel props were put in place. And that's what I remember seeing when I first came to Croft. And they looked to me a terribly violent intervention, and they're huge in the space. And they were indeed intended as a temporary solution, and yet they're still here 30 years later, which is why the first phase of the conservation, as we'll come to in a minute, is seeking to remove those props. But again, even though they look really very ugly, they've kept the building upright. And when the car reversed into the front of the building at the back end of last year, one of the reasons the whole front didn't fall down is because of these props. So we will think kindly of the people in 2012 who put these up, because they have managed to keep that building stable. And actually, it's not just those props, there are a series of them. I think there's another image. Yes, they're right the way across the back. They are tied in place in the attic with a series of other wires, like a forest up there. And again, when I first started, they gave me a hard hat and let me wander around. And I subsequently told Mark Radcliffe, our head of estates, that I'd been up there, and he gasped and said, "Rachel, no, it's not safe up there." But I didn't know that at the time and just went up. Though I have seen what's in the attics. But yes. Part of what we're doing now is pulling a lot of that out. So again, in the 50s, and actually even before the 50s, we think, cement was being used, infills within the panel. And we know now, with the benefit of hindsight, and those of us who live in old houses desperately trying to get rid of concrete and cement, know that it traps moisture, it means that buildings don't move, and we're much more aware of the need to use natural breathable materials like lime. But that wasn't always the case. So we are gently removing the cement that's there, because actually there's tons of it. And I think actually Mark's told me how many tons somewhere on here. But we found behind that concrete metal, which again has been rusted, which we need to remove. Widespread timber decay. This is the rotten American oak that I like to talk about quite a lot, but you can see in that picture quite how bad it is. And for saying that was put in the 1950s, it's quite significant, and it's been patched together and now needs to be fully removed. And there have been all sorts of structural steels put behind it. One of the first things that the team had to do was reveal all of these layers. And in revealing it, the thing with conservation, you never know what you're going to find. So there was a beautiful Gantt chart. And Roy at the back as a project manager will know all about beautiful Gantt charts with timelines and milestones and how it was all going to pan out. Actually, we've had to make quite a number of changes because in removing some of those panels and uncovering some steels that we didn't know were there, some metal props that we didn't know were behind all of these bits of wood, we've had to think again about the methodology, which is why it's been so important to have both archaeologists and architectural specialists and timber frame specialists, because this has been a whole meeting of minds about how to work with fragile materials to keep everything safe and secure. But it certainly wasn't what we were expecting to find. Which moves on as a segue to the next slide, because the other thing we weren't necessarily expecting to find was asbestos. And that has set us back quite substantially. There's asbestos found in a number of zones, and as soon as you find asbestos, particularly the kind of asbestos we found, it means that you need to pull back completely and think about how you can remove that safely. It also meant that we had to completely redesign the scaffolding. And at the beginning of the project, we had hoped to quite quickly be able to put scaffolding up that we could make accessible to members of the public. Because part of our desire for this project is to do it in the open and for us all to be able to enjoy, because it's so interesting, speaking to the craftspeople and having a look. But because of the asbestos, we've had to design the scaffolding, which then had to go back through planning permission, and you can imagine. So quite significant delays as a result of that. We are at the point now where we're just completing the removal of the asbestos. So we should be back to being able to be a bit more public facing with the engagement. So by the time that we get to the birthday weekend, we are going to be hoping to do more tours and talks on site, because we can open the site up a little bit more again. But yes, what we found so far has been asbestos. We've had to go back and look at the roof as well and secure new listed building consent, because the work that had been done previously didn't have listed building consent. So it's been a process of adapting to what we found and making sure that we're really documenting it and involving the authorities and conservation officers in Historic England. So it's a really careful and considered procedure, but has meant some delays. Yeah. So phase one, which is the back, as we talked about, is removing those awful kind of ironwork and steel posts, has been largely at the back of the building. 32 tons of concrete just from that one elevation. Really extraordinary. We've had to look at 396 timber repairs, and some of them are really substantial and some of them have been less so, but there's a significant amount of timber work, including inserting, I don't know what a structural needle is. I've been given these slides. Does anyone know what a structural needle is? I might have to go and find out, but it sounds impressive. But that has all been done very, very carefully by our team, and actually the majority of the work is being done by our conservation builders who are on our payroll. And then we're bringing in as many local craftspeople as we can. And one of the things that I think I would like the Trust to do in future is to invest more in heritage skills. It's one of the things that makes projects like this really hard, is the lack of heritage skills. And a number of the colleges that we used to work with now don't run heritage skills training courses. So we're thinking about how we can partner with other organisations, whether that's the Town Trust or others, and see if we can invest in that, because our two conservation builders, who aren't here tonight, so I'm going to embarrass them even though they're not here, one of them is in his mid-60s and he's fantastic and he's an absolute font of knowledge, but we don't yet have a succession plan. So that sort of thing worries me. So we do need to do some more investment in our heritage skills as a sector, but absolutely as an organisation. But what we have been able to do, which is good news, is we have now removed those steel props. So phase one, the biggest thing we wanted to achieve, as well as replacing all of the concrete panels, was removing those ugly props that we saw at the beginning, and they are gone. In fact, Ken Ludwig wanted us to send one over to the US. I'm not sure we've done that yet, but it is somewhere on a hope and aspiration. But it's starting to come alive. These have now gone, I promise. But you can see the extent of the work that's happened and all of the panels that have had to be removed. It really looks very, very different. But believe me, it should look like this, I am reassured. But it is quite a substantial intervention. So, moving forward again. October 25, I was sat at my desk. Actually at home, I was working at home that day because it was a Friday and I had various online meetings and my phone started ringing. I didn't think that was my phone at the time, but it kept ringing. And then I had a message from one of my team that said, Rachel, please can you answer urgently? It's never good, is it? And you get that. And he said, are you sitting down? Yes, yes, sitting down. I said, right, don't panic, it's not fallen over, but... And then he sent me a picture. And actually the picture looks a heck of a lot worse than this one because it still had a car in the middle of it. But yes, so in October 25, a vehicle did strike the front facade. But good luck, bad luck, as my mum always said. The good luck was it seemed to go right in between the major structural posts. So it didn't take out the corner post, which if it had done, it might have had a different message. But because it didn't hit that structural post and it didn't hit the window bay, actually the building kind of crumpled, but it coped. So it sort of absorbed the impact, partly because of those steels at the back, partly because things were tied together. So the building weathered that storm, although the damage is substantial. And I think that's the only image I've got of it, but inside it looked a heck of a lot worse. And that window that you can just about see in the corner of the screen, it moved by about 6 inches. But it moved intact. So it does need a lot of work, but the building just kind of went, okay, I'm going to breathe, but I'm not going to fall down. And we've collected all of the broken splinters and all of the bits of wood, and as far as possible, they will go back into the building. But yes, it has been substantial. And what it has highlighted is the need now to move on from that back elevation to the second phase, perhaps more quickly than we were planning to. We were going to complete the back elevation and then begin fundraising for the next elevation of the building. Unfortunately, because of this incident, we now have to do the whole thing. And I've seen various bits in the media about this, so let me try and explain. Yes, the insurance company will pay for that hole. I have met their managing director, he's looked me in the eye and he's absolutely reassured me of this point. But what you aren't going to do as a conservator is just stop there. We need to fix the entire elevation rather than just that one piece. So the insurance will cover the damage that can be very easily attributable to that car, but it won't cover the whole of the elevation. And we want to do, and we should do that whole elevation in one go. So hence the need to fundraise for all of that. And whilst our American donor Ken has been fantastic in giving us the £1 million for the rear, we do not have access to the money that we'll need to do the entire front elevation, which is why we've accelerated our fundraising campaign. So the plan is in a number of phases, and it might shift a bit. This is our fabulous architect and archaeologist, William. He's been on the project, and that's Ken, my favourite American. So phase 1 was the rear and the garden elevation. Phase 2 was always going to be that front facade, of which we are still looking at the various permissions to make sure that we've got all of those in place. Then we were going to move round the building. Then you get to the roof. I always thought you'd do the roof first, but apparently not. We will get then to the roof. And then there are some internal timber works, including the staircase. For those of you who remember the inside, the amazing staircase. For many years, as I understand it, prior to the building closed, we had to manage numbers of people on that staircase because it wasn't structurally tied in the way that we needed. So the final phase will be to address all of the interiors. And within that, as we work through these phases, we need to be thinking much more about what an open Hallscroft looks like. what's the visitor experience going to be? How are we going to put collections back into that space? What stories are we going to tell, and how are we going to do that? We don't have all of those answers now, but I have some thoughts. You'll have thoughts. I'd love to hear them. And then by the time we get to those phases, we can start thinking about how to open the building. In the meantime, we are going to be doing more openings of the garden. We are going to be doing more of that conservation in action, so that that building is still alive and still accessible to the town in interesting ways whilst it's being conserved. I don't see us putting a Harris fence around it and never letting anyone in for the next decade. But we're going to have to think agilely about how we provide access. And this is a 3D model, which Luke has put in here to talk about. But and actually, if you go on our website, you can play around with it. But one of the things William did, so William in that picture there, and he and his team have for the first time mapped the entire building and photographed every single part of it, every beam, every roof tile, everything, to have a complete record, and very cleverly stitched it all together in a 3D model which you can manipulate and move around. So we can think about how we make that digital asset available to people too. And just speaking to that idea of what we might look to do in the future with stories and how we bring the building to life. I think, as I said at the beginning, but I really want to reiterate, it is a living piece of Stratford's story, of Stratford's identity. It's a really fantastic building that so many of you have such warm connections with. And we need to somehow bring that within the storytelling in future. I also think the story of Susanna Hall, for those of you who have been in any of our events or activities or programming over the last couple of years, you might have spotted that this is the 3rd year now of our 3-year cycle about telling the stories of women, both in Shakespeare's life, in Shakespeare's plays and his art, and then the women who continued to keep that legacy alive. And I know those of you who are involved in the Harvard House project have been picking out some of those stories as well. But Susanna's place within this story is really interesting. And we have got a range of, again, really fabulous thinkers and scholars who are doing some active research, looking at the extant evidence and archival material, and thinking about how we can share those stories in future. But Paul, do you want to jump in at this point? Is there anything because that's very much something you've been involved in.
Well, it's a very exciting invitation. Thank you, Rachel. As Rachel's already said, the stories of Hall's Croft can be many because, well, it represents so many things. But you mentioned Susanna already. Obviously, there's John Hall, who is well known in the Stratford record. And many of you will know this book, John Hall, Master of Physic, a casebook from Shakespeare's Stratford, which was re-edited by the late Greg Wells as part of his PhD doing the history of medicine at Warwick University. And I turned Greg's PhD into an illustrated book account. But I'm mentioning this because it's a focal point for our collections, which illustrations of which run through this book. So it's a reminder that the Birthplace Trust has invested very substantially over decades since acquiring Hall's Croft in collections material artifacts in order to tell the stories of early modern medicine, portraits, medicine jars, fleams, forceps, urine jars. We've got all of these artifacts. And in thinking about early modern medicine and John Hall's medical practice and how Susanna played a part in that.
More so than I think that she's been given.
Absolutely. There's that formulaic phrase on her epitaph about comfort's cordial, but I'm pretty certain, one doesn't have to imagine too much in order to have a picture of Susanna Hall visiting John Hall's patients, or people popping in to see her, to ask for her advice while her husband is on horseback to Worcester, and staying overnight and coming back the next day. So it's very much storytelling which is rooted in the community, and that's also including, of course, Hall's patients, not only in Stratford, but in the environs of wider Warwickshire and Worcestershire. So this is all known about as well. So it's a great occasion for that community research. Since this book appeared, the University of Brighton has led a research project on Susanna, which has been very exciting, led to a recreation or creation of a female physic garden in Hall's Croft. I don't know if any of you managed to see that. It was just after lockdown and the whole thing was being created. We had limited access and it was tricky. Certainly our student groups have been benefiting from using Hall's Croft, which they still do. You've seen the bits of the building where the conservation work is very substantial and much needed, of course. But the cafe bit at the back, which many of you will remember, was turned into a teaching room before lockdown. And I've been putting some talks in my diary today for a visiting group from Montana who are here in April, using Hall's Croft Cafe. And I'm delighted to say that we still are able to let visiting groups of students into the garden. So when they're here for a few days from overseas, they really do feel like they own Hall's Croft. It becomes a bit of a campus for them. They can't go into the house, absolutely no way. And if conservation works are going on, they take priority. So they might get bumped, and have to do their classes elsewhere. But we've had, some good summers and springs of having short courses at Hall's Croft. And I think also it's worth remembering, the other end of the research perspective, which is the curatorial history of Hall's Croft from 1951 onwards. The Festival of Britain has been mentioned. A PhD student working closely with me and Chris Lataris at the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham, is working on the curatorial history of the Birthplace Trust. He's looking at each of the 5 houses and slicing into a key moment in their history and asking, well, why? Why would this be the case? Why did the Birthplace Trust want Hall's Croft in 1951? What was the Festival of Britain story's impact on how the house was then understood? And 2 things quickly become clear, and I bet you Roger Fox talks about this when you show him around, because he'll be talking about his late father's intentions. But it was always a place intended for the use by the community. As you know, the Poetry Festival started there in 1953 and ran there very successfully for many years before it moved to Mason Croft and the Shakespeare Centre and so on. And so it was a place understood to be about performance. Hands up if you saw, I think it was Second Thoughts years ago. Tim's at the back. Were you in it, Tim? Do you know what I'm going to say?
Yes.
The herbal bed. The herbal bed. I remember you as but I saw you as Mongolian. Was that 29 years ago? It was quite a long time ago. No, I'm talking about written about the same in that time was Peter Whelan's play, The Herbal Bed. You saw it in the other plays? They've just done a production which was excellent in the bed just up the road. Did anyone see that? Yes. Brilliant. Very good. But I once saw it at Hall's Croft anyway, I think it was Second Thoughts. But that's a play about John Hall and Susanna and her suing for defamation of character, which is alluded to, this intelligent, independent. So that's just like an appropriate community use, for example. But the other thing that sparks the curatorial imagination is that the National Health Service had just started. So here was the Birthplace Trust, 6 years after the National Health Service, or soon after, let's say, curating a space about medicine in which people could find out about folk cures and herbal remedies and the history of medicine. So that's a really important, I think, compelling part of what we see when we look at Hall's Croft curatorially and from a research perspective.
No, I agree, yeah. And I think that, and thank you for that, Paul, because I think what you've talked to is just the range of different avenues we could take in how to bring the house back to life. And I think that sense of having performance and visitor experience and some of the remarkable collections. I mean, the paintings are extraordinary. You know, we can have a really joyful and playful visitor experience. And we are starting to test the thinking around some of that. So we don't have the detailed model and we haven't got the business plans and everything together, but we have started to test what some of that might look like, particularly because, and I'm going to bring us on to Ken, and I want to show a short video. Because if you were here,
Could I just add also, it is true, I believe, that Marie Corelli rented that place.
Yes,
She did.
yes.
And Hall's Croft, for me personally, I was a student at, I think, 14 years of age in the downstairs area used for teaching. There was Birmingham University had a microprocessor development course there. Nobody had seen microprocessors before. Hall's Croft changed my life, because I then went on to design multi-microprocessor systems before any other British company was doing. I was importing chips from the States that were not ready for release so that we could develop the computers long before other people had. And the company I worked for was in Leamington, and they bought out a much bigger company at Baggington Airport, which of course now is being changed. But Hall's Croft was where it all started for me.
Think about that house bearing witness to so many different moments in our history. That's fascinating. And it does occur, Paul, and we should note this, that one of the things that we should do is some oral history with people to capture these kinds of stories, because we need to capture these stories and have them as part of the record. And who knows, one day we might turn that back into your microprocessing pen of the day. And I've done things like that before. I did, for those of you who remember right back in the midst of time, I used to work at the National Trust, and there was a property called Upton House. And one day I happened to be duty manager, and a chap walked in and he talked to the front door guide and he said, I remember being here when it was a bank. And I said, it was. And I got this message on the radio and I ran up to the front door and said, so I hear you've got a story. And he told me the story of the Second World War and Upton House being the place that the family who owned it, which was the Samuel family, who had a major bank in London, moved all their staff to the relative safety of Warwickshire. And at the same time, some of Lord Bearstead's pictures, and effectively created a bank in a country house. And from that one story, we did a whole year's programme where we turned Upton House back to the 1940s. And it was one of the most extraordinary experiences I ever had as a curator, because pretty much every day that it was open, somebody would come in and share a memory or talk about it. There were people that genuinely were moved to tears because their stories were being voiced. So there's no reason why we couldn't have a year of the microprocessor story or a year of all of these stories. This is the point. I think this house could be just such a storytelling treasure chest in the future. And I would really like to capture as many of your ideas and your stories as well to put into that mix. But one of the reasons I think that that's also genuinely going to work is because part of our move of the trust at the moment anyway is I've got a creative vision for the trust for the future. And our creative vision for the trust, and Paul and colleagues will know this, and I won't labour the point because you're not here to hear me wax lyrical about strategy. But part of this is genuinely leaning into what makes us special. And what makes us special and completely unique are these houses and the collections and Stratford. And we need to unite all of those things, but with creativity, because Shakespeare was endlessly creative. There is no better inspiration. So what we do should be creative and playful and inspirational and curious and different. So it is a segue back to Ken, because he's a playwright. Mm-hmm. And he had his moment of light bulb moment when he walked around Hall's Croft. He came to visit us one day and he met with a colleague of mine. And he had indicated that he was quite interested in supporting us. But we thought it might be more about our learning programmes. So we started to show him some of the incredible work that our learning teams, and he's very passionate because he wrote a book on how to teach Shakespeare. And the book is basically about how you use Shakespeare's language to fire the imagination of young children. So we showed him our work with the primary school children. He absolutely loved it and is still a very great advocate of that work. But then in the afternoon, we had a bit of a gap in his diary, and we thought, well, we'll walk him round Halls Croft. And from the second he walked into the house, you could see his eyes going. And we'd started to talk about the problems of the building and the conservation, and we were on the wobbly staircase. And he tells this story later because he didn't tell me at the time, but he turned round to he had an executive assistant with him and said, we can sort this. So this remarkable and generous man, who is largely based in Washington, DC, but comes over to see us, and he's now an honorary member of our council. And genuinely, when he's in town, we should have him here because he'd love to meet you all. He is such a warm person. And what he's doing as a result of the car going into the building, he's now doing absolutely everything he can in the US to help us get the message out and to see if we can find any other US donors that might love Halls Croft too. So I did just want to play you, if you don't mind. I thought because he's not here and I want to give him the final word, as it were, I'll play you a little bit. And this is the campaign video that, and you'll see his.
Hi, I'm Ken Ludwig. I'm a playwright, but I'm speaking to you today as a lifelong student of Shakespeare. You know how important Shakespeare is to our entire world. He's the lifeblood of our literary and intellectual heritage. Without Shakespeare, there is no English language as we know it today, and there is no English theater as we know it today, and it's one of the glories of our cultural universe. I'm a passionate supporter of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. And I'm speaking to you today about a building which is part of the trust called Halls Croft. And this building means the world to me. Halls Croft is a gorgeous Jacobean structure. It is where Susanna Shakespeare, Shakespeare's daughter, moved into with her new husband, Dr. John Hall, soon after they were married. It's one of the most human connections you still have with Shakespeare the man. About a year ago, I decided to make a large donation to save Halls Croft from literally falling down. For many years, it has been held up by these unattractive, not to say ugly, metal beams to support half of the structure because of the deterioration of the wood and the shifting landscape over the past 400 years. Now we need to find new donors for phase 2 of the project. To begin the work, we have to raise $620,000. And that's why I'm reaching out to you. I supported the first phase of this project because I believe so deeply in this cause. I want to support the new phase as well. And now I'm asking you to carry that work forward. Every donation will make a difference. Every gift is tax deductible through Shakespeare's Birthplace, and every act of support helps ensure that Halls Croft remains standing. So there's something truly special we can do this year. We can support Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust with an eye to preserving its cultural history and this cultural masterpiece. Thank you for your generosity, your passion, and your belief in the enduring power of Shakespeare. Let me end with Shakespeare's own words, the end of Sonnet 30. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. Let's not add Halls Croft to the losses of our past. Thanks. I'm Ken Ludwig, and thank you for listening.
Lovely. He is genuinely so generous and so warm, and he hopped on that call and just recorded that for us. And that was because it was just at the end of the US tax year, and it was a suitable time to do this message. So we are doing active fundraising, both in the UK and overseas. And Luke and his team in development are talking to people all the time, and we will approach major funders like the National Lottery and the National Lottery Memorial Fund. But we have also received donations from local people. It's some small, some big, but every penny is so gratefully received. And I, very soon after the original incident with the car going into the facade, which made the national news. No one likes to be in the Daily Mail, but we were. But one good thing came out of being in the Daily Mail, which was a letter that arrived on Mark Radcliffe's desk that he then took a picture of and sent to me. And it was anonymous. And it was from a man who had sellotaped a £5 note. I know, it made me cry. Sellotaped a £5 note and said, I'm an old age pensioner. I love this building. I remember as part of my childhood. This is all I can afford. Please take it. So every donation has been given with real care, with real love for this remarkable building. And we intend to absolutely continue that campaign and the conservation work with real and genuine care, which does mean going a bit slowly, going really thoughtfully. But opportunities like this are really important to us because I can come and share some of it, even though I'm not an expert, and you really do need to speak to Mark Radcliffe. But I want to reassure you that this work is going on really diligently, and I'd like for you all to come and have a look when you can. We've got the birthday weekend coming up where we're going to be doing some tours, getting the garden open. So there will be opportunities across the year to come back and enjoy, as Paul talked about, the visit garden, the wellness garden, but also a look around at least the exteriors, and if we can get into any of the interiors. But yeah, questions. But I hope you found that helpful as an update, and I am sorry that I am not Mark. Very hard.
I would like to just share with you something that happened to me pre-COVID. There was an exhibition in Croft about some of the instruments that John Hall used to use, and really I found out more about what they used to do with urine than I ever thought.
Didn't we have a curtain over one of the rooms that said if you look behind here it's at your peril or something? Because I think they were
Okay, so questions please.
And I'm very happy to take questions on Croft or anything else about SBT. Don't be shy. There's hands at the back.
Yes.
Can I just ask actually?
Yes.
How long do you think this project is going to take? Considering you've got money considerations as well, but do you have a sort of target date for it to be completed?
We need to complete phase 1 this year. It was looking to be spring. It might be delayed a little bit before we can really ascertain. It is a multi-year project, and I think it's really difficult to know because we haven't got the funding in place. I would imagine that this is probably a 5 to 10 year minimum. I would say I think it's a substantial piece of work that unless we were to receive a donation or perhaps funding from someone like the lottery for the whole amount in one go, which isn't, it is still a possibility and we will apply for that. But in the public sector, as some of you will know, it's really competitive to make the case because it would need up to £10 million to do all of the phases. If we were to do all of the phases, even then it would take many years to get the craftspeople in to do it. So it's a bit of a whiffly-waffly answer to say sometime, Jenny, I think. There's another hand over. Hello.
Yeah, what materials will they be using to replace these concrete panels that were causing?
As far as possible, recreating the original materials that would have been used. So kind of horsehair and lath and plaster and lime, things that are breathable. There are cases where we need to use more modern materials that wouldn't have been around in the Jacobean period. And we hope we're not recreating the problems of the past with our own version of concrete. But you can only do what modern science is telling you at the time. But the desire is to try to use as many natural, breathable materials that would have been part of the house's history, but where the landscape has moved, where the structure is just not able to be taken back in that way, there might still have to be steels and interventions. But what we can do that is different is we can completely photograph and record so that if someone of my successors are stood here in 100 years' time, they'll know what we did because we've documented it. So they shouldn't have to go back and peel it all open. It's largely about lime and breathable materials these days.
Is it true it's actually sinking?
It's a posh word. Landscape has moved is the message that I've been told to. It's not that it's sinking, but I do think that the ground has changed and water courses have changed and it has moved. The building has moved. And I think most buildings of that age will have moved. But it is part of why we're having to do things slightly differently. Because what would have made structural sense in the 17th century just doesn't quite and can't work anymore.
And I know that the original Horsecroft was added to.
Yes.
So is there any dichotomy between the two buildings now? It's showing up.
Bits, particularly around the kitchen extension at the back, which has really, really fascinated historians of domestic interiors, but because it was the first time a kind of kitchen extension was put in that they can really get their hands and see how it was done. But structurally it's fine. But what they are trying to do is record the detail of when they think certain, so there's the timber, we've done age analysis, so we can document the various ages and development of the structure, but it's largely in that kitchen extension where it was put on slightly later. The rest of it is quite contemporary. The Victorians didn't knock it around too much, which unlike most of our other buildings, the Victorians did not get their hands on this.
Somebody else, yes.
And then I'll come back, yeah.
Something you didn't mention, which
Yeah.
was always touted around years ago as being one of the major problems with the house, is the dreaded Death Watch people.
Yes.
Yes, is it there, or was it just something to keep people quiet, saying they can't do this?
They have found various pest infestations,
Yeah.
but nothing. So I believe we had very small evidence, but it's not been material. The biggest issue has been the American red oak, and that has been more susceptible to all kinds of pests, not just death watch, but actually woodworm, just good old fashioned woodworm, because of its softness and in the interior. Normally with oak, you expect to be able to cut through it, and it's largely still solid. It's spongy in the middle, but it's not largely subject to a huge infestation of death watch beetle, is my understanding. There was another hi, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is there any plan to investigate the garden more deeply? Because this building is quite a long way from Guild Pits,
Yeah.
which is where Guild Street
Yeah.
is now,
Yeah.
which is where all people's rubbish was tipped. And then in the winter, when the floods subsided in the spring, they were sucked out and floated down the river. Because this building is so far away, they probably had a pit in which they threw various amounts of rubbish away. Some of those pits, you can find remarkable bits of evidence about leather goods, but also maybe even foods, shellfish, and that kind of thing, which might help to find out what their diets were like back at that sort of period of time. So is there any plan to look at the garden more deeply?
There has been archaeology done at Croft over the decades since the Trust owned it. There are archaeological reports in our archive, and indeed artifacts. Will Mitchell, whose photograph came up and who's done the 3D imaging of Croft, is an archaeologist.
Yeah.
So I think this is one for Will to advise on, but I'm pretty certain that
We've done some.
we've done.
But
I'm
I'm sure that there are more things that we could uncover.
Yeah.
What I would like to continue doing, and as Paul knows, because it's his absolute passion too, is continue using the building and the grounds and the gardens as a research project. Because it will continue to give up stories, even things that we think we know, we can go back and have another look. So if we haven't done it now, I think that we should. And there is such a lot of interest. So Will is now I think he's at Huddersfield, and there are lots and lots of universities that want to be part of this. And I think the answer to your question is we could do more of that.
I remember Will being successful at finding the rubbish pits at New Place, because he was one of the lead archaeologists on the dig from 2011 to 2016. Yeah.
I'll just add then that the story of the supply of fresh water to Stratford, which came from Snitterfield originally, and that's why the Blue Cap Reservoir was built. I happen to live just down from it in Blue Cap Road. I spoke to Severn Trent, and they would not give me any details of anywhere where any pipes run, because they're concerned about some form of terrorism or stupidity to poison
Right.
the water supply.
Yes.
But I do have a paper written by a guy who researched, firstly, Snitterfield's water supply. There's a place called Pump House, and some Polish people live there, and I'm in touch with them. But when the water came down to Stratford, only some houses got this water supply, and people filled in their wells. And then the guy put the prices up, of course. It's interesting. I don't know whether Hall's Croft was ever connected to that supply. So where did their water come from? Again, the story of water supplies to houses in Britain generally is one of discovering the politics and the attitude of people at the time. And of course, the Great Stink in London in 1851 really started to make things move in terms of hygiene.
And I think I agree with all of that, and it's really fascinating. But it's also about the fact that we just didn't know, we haven't got documentation, and there aren't plans. But this is why this project has been so focused in its early stages and documenting absolutely everything. So now we do know where the pipes run, because that has been a challenge with some of our other spaces. In fact, even on Henley Street and the Shakespeare Centre, there's water courses all over the place that actually aren't on maps, that present all sorts of challenges. So the fact that we now know where things run. But I agree, the history of it is fascinating. There were other hands coming up, I can see. I'm going to go to the back and make sure I don't miss anyone, please.
Are there any plans long term for this building? Because as the lot of you are aware, there is a desperate museum.
Yeah.
For the town. And this is just a substantial building.
It is, and yes, there are plans for it. And although I've been a bit waffly about what they might be, because I genuinely don't have all the detail, I don't think it's going to be as a substantial museum for a variety of reasons. One, I think if we had to kit it out with all the environmental conditions that you would need in order to long-term store and display all of the objects that we might have, I think it would be really difficult, and it might take something of the gorgeous atmosphere away. But that is not to say that we won't put collections back. We absolutely will, because they should be back in that building. But in terms of a museum and a town museum, one of the things that we're trying to work on, and Jan, we've been working together in partnership with the Stratford Society, is using other spaces that we have, like Harvard House, to get more collections out. And that is the intent in the future, is to have a town museum. And there are plans afoot with part of the Gateway and other things. But in the meanwhile, whilst we don't have all of the money to do all of those things, we can use Harvard House and we can get collections out and about. And ultimately, yes, it will be a museum of type, but I don't think, for me, it's about filling it with display cases. I think it's filling it with objects, but also trying to recreate historic interiors. Lindsay.
Yes, I recently bought a brochure from the early 1950s, which shows that Hall's Croft was designated as the place for the festival club.
Yes.
So subscribers to the Shakespeare Festival could retire there and relax and
I've seen that too.
Read and feel part of Stratford.
Couldn't we do that again?
It was the room. I think it was the rooms next door to the cafe, which is now the reception and shop.
Yeah.
And it's filled with comfortable lounge chairs and like a gentleman's club.
I think I've seen that, and they're fabulous images. And there are, whether it's that space or upstairs, there's 2 or 3 rooms upstairs that actually, I'm not sure were open to the public. They may have been at some point in the past, but certainly when I first came to the Trust, they were not part of the visitor route. They were where the team would work. They were back office spaces. But that is where Mary Corelli and other people were. They had these rooms at the top. And as part of my daydreaming of this, and Ken and I had a whole conversation about it, could we do little writers' retreats? Could we use those spaces that maybe aren't on part of the core visitor route? So could we use the whole building in creative and interesting ways? So I love the fact that we could reach into the past for that kind of thing, to use different spaces within the building.
Also, just to add to that, the latest thinking by timber framed building experts, just before lockdown, was the old shop, the gift shop, in Hall's Croft. Apparently, that's the oldest part of the building.
Yeah.
So, when we imagine what it might look like, we're going to rethink, I'm sure, how we display it and set it up as a house, because we can, because we'll have the time and the ability to do that, wouldn't we? But I'm pretty certain the oldest part of the building will not become a shop again.
No, there might be other ways of doing that, and actually the cafe's not well sited because of that reason too. But I would like us to think about how we could use all the building.
Yeah.
Could the situation we now find ourselves in with Paul's Croft have been avoided? And are we certain that we're not going to get similar problems to the other Paul Shakespeare properties?
Do you mean the situation of the conservation or the car going into it or both?
No, nothing to do with the car.
Okay.
The ongoing.
I think old buildings have one job in life, which is to try and fall down. That's what they try to do. That is what all old buildings try to do. That is their mission. So it is always a difficult thing. There is no perfect point. We will never have finished conserving any of these buildings. But what we are doing is placing a lot of emphasis. And I talked very briefly about my vision for the trust and this new creative vision, and having our collections and our properties at the heart of that. That means one of our priorities, of course, it should be the care and stewardship and the investment in these buildings. So could it have been avoided? I don't know is the honest answer. Buildings are always going to be different, but are we going to try much